morning, everybody. This is Unit 3, Lesson 4, and we are tackling nested loop statements. Okay, so with nested loops, I think I want to have a look at some revision just first of all. We use loops for repetitive tasks that you know already. And you should also know already that the Windows form, your application runs automatically in a continuous loop, waiting for something to happen. So for the user to click a button, for example. You're really good with loops nowadays because we use loops a lot with arrays. We're also going to use loops when we read and write to files, and that we're going to tackle next. And the main loop statements in VB would be the for loop, the while loop, but there's also quite a few different loop statements. If we go have a look at tutorials point, you'd go to loops, and we'd see here that there's do loops, for loops, the for each statement that you also can use at this stage, a while loop, and the do loop actually has got either a while or an until statement at the start or at the end of the loop. As long as you are really good with for loops and one of the other loop statements, the while loop for example, it's okay. The other loop statements are easy enough to tackle whenever you get to that at a later stage. So we'd use loops in programming languages very often. This is an example of a for loop to display 1, 2, 3 to the user. And loops then, we're going to find that in all the programming languages. So here at the bottom is an example of a C-based. So C, C#, C++, and Java shares the same syntax. It's an example of a for loop that's going to do exactly the same as the statement above. Once you understand loop statement, it's really easy to adopt it to a different language when one day you're going to move over to a new language. Let's just have a look at nested statements then for a moment before I go discuss nested loops. I can really nest about any statement that we find in programming, not just in VB but in Java, in any of the programming languages really. So we can easily nest if statements. We can easily nest procedural function calls. Let's have a look at nested if statements. An example from programming logic that you did last semester. If I need to test two variables, for example, let's say a code and a price in order to get to some discount value, then if I've got a few constant values defined like that, I can very easily have a nested if statement where I've got one if statement inside of another. And it is normally a really good sense to test if I've got two variables. Use an outer if statement to test one variable, let's say the code. So if the code is A, else if the code is B, else if the code is C, and use another if statement inside. If the code is A, then let's test the price. Would it be this or that? If the code is B, let's again test the price. Would it be this or that? Okay, this is normally better because it's easier to maintain. If I use an AND to combine the conditions, it's a little bit less maintainable code that we write. Okay, so how would this if statement execute, for example, if I've got a code that's B and a price that's 800? The code would start on line 33 and test. If code is equal to A, does code store A? And the answer would be no. So the code would jump immediately to line 41. Test. If the code stores B, and this would be the case, it's a true statement, so then line 43 would execute. Test if the price is less than 500. This would be a false result because the price is 800. So immediately the code would jump to the else statement on line 45 and assign price percentage B for high to discount percentage. Thereafter the code would jump to the end if, would jump to the next end if, and continue with whatever statement I've got on line 52. So we actually use nested if statements quite a bit in the past. You might think, did I ever use nested procedure or function calls? The answer is actually also a definite yes. Again, if we can have a look at an example from programming logic from the first semester, then something like this would be extremely familiar to you, where one procedure button calculate click would call a function on line 29. And this function call, this just shows us one procedure can call another procedure or function. We've done that also many times. We just coded the button click event procedure to call another function. This function on its own can obviously call another function or procedure if it needs to. So we very often had procedures or functions that called other procedures or functions. With nested statements, we also have something called recursive function calls, but this is an advanced topic and we're not going to discuss that with beginners at all. Okay, so we're ready now to have a look at nested loops. With nested loops, we then have something that we call, just to give a name to each one of them, the outside loop in orange over here is called the outer loop. And the loop that we specify on the inside is called the inner loop. So two terms that you just first of all need to know. Inside loop and the outside loop, the inner loop and the outer loop. Important to know about the execution of these nested loops. The outer loop will have one execution, one iteration, and then the inner loop will start and completely execute. So all the iterations of the inner loop will execute. Then the outer loop will again execute one iteration, and that would get to the inner loop to execute again all the iterations of the inner loop. And this would continue until the outer loop reaches its end and stops. I have the same loop counter for both loops. So I've called the first loop counter row and the second one column, just to make life easy. And all that we do over here is to use a label. Initially the label is cleared. In the inner loop, I'm just adding, that's the plus equal to, an asterisk. Every time that the loop body is called, I'm adding an asterisk to the output. And as soon as the inner loop is finished, I'm adding a new line to the loop body, or to the label, sorry. It's again plus equal to add the data. Let's see what would happen exactly. I've got the two variables. We've got row and we've got column, and I'm just going to show you what's the output. So, right initially the line 11 will clear the output. Line 12 will initialize row to 1, test if row is less or equal to 3, and then the inner loop, line 13, will start. That will initialize column to 1. Test that column is less or equal to 5, and it is, so it's going to display 1 asterisk in the output. Then line 15 executes, which adds 1 to column. Line 13 will execute again. It tests column less or equal to 5, and that's true. So line 14 will execute, and it's going to add 1 asterisk to the label. Thereafter, line 15 executes, adds 1 to column. Line 13 will execute again, test column less or equal to 5, and yes, it's definitely the case. So that means the statement inside the inner loop will execute once more. It's going to add an asterisk to the output. Next column executes, which would add 1 to the column value. Goes to line 13, test column less or equal to 5, and it's true, so that means add 1 to the column, to the output. Next column will execute, add 1 to the output, go to line, add 1 to column, go to line 15, test column less or equal to 5, that's true, so the statement inside the inner loop will execute, and it adds an asterisk to the output. Then next column will execute, it adds 1 to column, goes back to line 13, test column less or equal to 5, and no, it's not the case at all. So that means the inner loop is stopped. Line 16 will execute. It says go put a new line. I'm just going to show that with, let's quickly see if the yellow highlight. I'm going to indicate the new line character with the yellow highlight and the full stop. So that says move the cursor over to the next line. Cursor will be over here next to the start of the second line. Next row will now execute, and that adds 1 to row. So row becomes 2. Control will jump to line 12 because we've done the outer loop now once only. Next row added 1 to row, and we jump to the start of the row. So now it tests, is row less or equal to 3, and it's definitely the case. Then line 13 will execute, which initialize column to 1. Test is column less or equal to 5, and yes, it's definitely the case. So that means the statement inside the inner loop will execute. 1 asterisk is displayed in the, or added to the label. Next column will execute, and it's adding 1 to column. It's going back to the start of the inner for loop, testing column less or equal to 5. Yes, it's definitely the case. And then it's adding 1 asterisk. Next column executes, add 1 to column. Jumps back to the start, column less or equal to 5 is true. So that means 1 more asterisk is displayed. Next column executes, adds 1 to column. Control jumps back to the start of the for loop, test column less or equal to 5. It's true. So that means the statement in the loop body will execute. It adds 1 more asterisk to the output. Next column executes again, and it tests and adds another asterisk, and then it finds the end of the loop. And in quite the same manner, it's going to print the last line of the output. So that loop statement inside a loop statement, the nested loop over here, will produce the following output for us. 3 rows, because we said there must be 3 rows, are 5 asterisks per row. Exactly like that. If I run the code, that's exactly what would be displayed for us. And I showed you the iteration. So, by the second iteration of the inner loop, row would have a value 1, column would have a value 2. The third iteration of the inner loop, row would have a value 1, column would have a value 2. If the outer loop executed again, then it starts again with the inner loop, and it goes through all the values like this. So right at the end, when this loop is finished execution, it would have gone through all these values. That would stop the loop, and that would stop the outer loop, because row will not be less or equal to 3 anymore. Okay, so quite important that you understand how these loops work. I start from 1 to 3, so that means 3 rows. How many columns? 1 to 5. And it's maybe nice and easy for you guys, that's beginners, to call the outer loop counter row and the inner loop counter column. We now have to have a look at a second example, a little bit more complex. Have a real good look at this code. The outer loop goes from 1 to 4. The inner loop now goes from row to 4. What result would that now have? Okay, if we think about it, right at the start, for the very first iteration of the outer loop, row would have a value 1. So that means the inner loop will execute 1 to 4, 4 times. The next time the outer loop executes, row would have a value of 2. So that means the inner loop will execute from 2 to 4, 2, 3 and 4. So only 3 times. Only 3 asterisks would be displayed. The next time the outer loop executes, row would have a value 3. So that means the inner loop will execute from 3 to 4 times. 3 and 4, it would only display 2 asterisks. And then the last time the for loop, the outer loop executes, row would have a value of 4, and that means the inner loop will go from 4 to 4 only once. And what result will we have now? 4, 3, 2, 1 extra asterisks would be displayed. Have a real careful look at this. So row goes from 1 to 4, then 3 to 4, then 2 to 4, then 3 to 4, and then 4 to 4. So rather important that you have a real good look at that. We've got quite a few programs now that you can go and write. Actually do the planning thereof and then write the programs. What do we need in terms of planning? Planning actually doesn't need to be not complicated. It's got to just say what steps we need. So if we don't use that other document, I can just specify I've got some variables, and my steps of the program would be to declare the variables. I've got a loop from 1 to 5, a loop from 1 to 3, and now display an asterisk and display a new line. So what would this give us? We need to be able to determine the output. I've got 5 rows of 3 asterisks. Oops, their word helps me again. Does it again. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's what this output will give me, because I've got 5 rows from 1 to 5 and the columns goes from 1 to 3. Obviously, if I specify the column must go from 0 to 3, then I will have 4 asterisks in the output. Okay, but just for simplicity, we're going to say at this stage use 1 to 3 for the output. Okay. If we go have a look at the planning assignments, then there's program 71 until I think 76. And we start rather easy. We just need to display quite a few asterisks, but also go have a look at the questions posed. We've got a varying number of asterisks to display. There's again a fixed number of asterisks to display, and now the user needs to tell me how many rows must be displayed. Every time there's 4 asterisks per row, but only display 1 asterisk at a time, so use nested loops. And then we get to a little bit more complicated programs. So the user can choose a times table, and I need to display every time the times table. This result over here you'll need to calculate. This example will only use 1 loop, but program 76 displays the full times table from 0 all the way down to 12 times 12. And over here this will definitely need a nested loop. Okay, so nice and interesting programs for you to plan, and if you code it, it's an optional extra and a bonus.